At his wife's funeral, a millionaire surgeon is approached by a mysterious little girl in a wheelchair. She gently touches his arm and whispers 3 words that shake him to his core. He doesn't know her name, but within days he discovers she's connected to a woman he once loved and a daughter he never knew existed. What happens next will break and heal your heart. Dear friend, what you're about to experience is not just a story. It's a deeply human journey about lost resilience and the quiet, unexpected ways love finds us when we need it most. If this is your first time here, I invite you to drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. We love hearing your voice. And if you're someone who believes in second chances, in the hidden strength of ordinary people, and in stories that stay with you long after they end, consider subscribing and tapping the bell icon. We share moments that matter. Thank you for being part of this one. Now, let's begin. The rain began just before dawn, as if the sky itself were mourning. Overlooking San Francisco Bay, the cemetery blurred beneath a veil of mist, the tombstones glistening like silent sentinels. A violinist stood off to the side playing something slow and aching, Elise Callahan's favorite Bach sonata. But Jonathan Callahan barely registered the sound. He stood still as marble beside the casket, his body rigid, his face unreadable, his heart in pieces. Elise had been his anchor in a world of sharp edges. The one person who saw the man beneath the accolades. As a world-renowned surgeon and hospital magnate, Jonathan had built his life on precision and control. He lived in logic, operated in certainty, and made decisions that saved lives daily. But none of that prepared him for what it meant to lose the one person who gave all that meaning. The ceremony was elegant, expected politicians, CEOs, philanthropists, people who respected Jonathan, who admired Elise. But standing among them, Jonathan felt like a ghost in his own life. Not even the expensive wool of his tailored suit could protect him from the chill inside him. And then she appeared. A small girl in a navy coat, edges damp from the drizzle. She moved through the crowd in a wheelchair, silent and steady, her presence somehow both invisible and impossible to ignore. Jonathan noticed her immediately, not because she stood out, but because she didn't. She stopped beneath the old redwood tree. Elise loved the one with roots so deep they'd once joked it remembered more about them than they did. Jonathan's eyes followed her as she turned slowly, deliberately, and began wheeling toward him. No one else moved. No one seemed to notice. She came to a stop beside him. No introduction, no permission asked. Her hand, small and cold, reached out and gently touched his arm. It was the first human touch he'd felt since Elise died. Jonathan flinched, not out of fear, but recognition. The contact held something familiar, something that bypassed thought and struck straight to memory. He looked down, meeting her gaze for the first time. Her hair clung to her face from the rain. Her lips trembled, but her eyes didn't waver. And then she spoke. "Are you lonely?" 3 words, that was all. But they shattered him. Jonathan couldn't answer. His throat clenched, his chest ached. Something inside him broke, not loudly, not visibly, but absolutely. A single tear slipped down his cheek, his first since Elise passed. He didn't wipe it away. The girl said nothing more. She simply let go of his arm, turned her wheelchair, and disappeared into the blur of black umbrellas and gray sky. No one stopped her. No one even asked. That night, Jonathan sat alone in his penthouse glass walls, framing a glittering skyline that suddenly felt sterile, lifeless. Elise's mug was still on the kitchen counter. Her book still marked halfway. Her scent lingered faintly in the air, like memory refusing to fade. But she was gone. And now, so was that girl. He replayed her voice over and over in his head. "Are you lonely? Yes, he wanted to scream. Yes, more than I've ever been. But it wasn't just loneliness she touched. It was something deeper, a wound long sealed and long ignored. The way her eyes searched his, the knowing in them, it didn't feel accidental. It felt like she knew him, not the headlines or hospital legacy. Him. He thought about Elise, how she used to say, "Control is comforting, but it's not living." She had spent years coaxing him into colors, into spontaneity, into vulnerability. But Jonathan had never truly surrendered. Not until that moment by the casket. Not until a child pulled the grief out of him with a single devastating question. He didn't know her name. He didn't know why she'd come. But he knew with a certainty he hadn't felt in years that he had to find her. That question wasn't random. It was planted. A seed. And seeds have a way of growing into the cracks we try to ignore. Grief, when left unattended, becomes a kind of rot. It hollows. It silences. But sometimes it only takes a whisper to awaken what we thought we'd buried for good. And that whisper had come from a child he'd never seen before, who somehow saw through everything. Jonathan stood up from the window ledge and walked into Elise's studio. He hadn't opened the door since she died. Now he breathed in the scent of oil paint and lavender, her brushes still stained with unfinished dreams. He stared at her last painting half complete. An open field, a single tree, a figure standing alone beneath it, faceless. He touched the canvas. He didn't know it yet, but the truth waiting for him wasn't just about the girl. It was about a woman he once loved. A choice he made and buried like a scar. And a daughter he never knew existed. But that comes next. Jonathan Callahan wasn't the kind of man who chased ghosts. He believed in facts, test results, surgical plans. His world was grounded in what could be proven, measured, diagnosed. But ever since the girl at the funeral whispered those 3 impossible words, his world had started to bend in ways he couldn't explain. He couldn't sleep, couldn't think, couldn't stop wondering who she was. He told himself it was the grief, a mind trick in the fog of mourning. But deep down, something had shifted, something he hadn't felt in years. An urgency, a pull as if the past wasn't done with him yet. 3 days after the funeral, he called Gabe his personal assistant, the only person in his inner circle he truly trusted. Gabe had been with him for over a decade, had seen him through surgeries and scandals and silence. So when Jonathan said, "Find her," Gabe didn't ask questions. He just nodded. The search took longer than expected. No one at the funeral recognized the girl. She hadn't signed any guest book. She wasn't on any invite list. But Gabe was persistent. He tracked down security footage, spoke to the groundskeeper, even followed up with a local volunteer group that sometimes worked with underprivileged children in the area. A week later, Gabe walked into Jonathan's office, his expression tighter than usual. "I found her," he said, placing a thin manila folder on the mahogany desk. Jonathan stared at the folder like it might explode. Then slowly he opened it. Her name was Mira Sullivan, 9 years old, lived in a small community near Napa Valley, recently orphaned. Her mother, Rebecca Sullivan, had died of cancer just 6 months earlier. Mira had no known relatives, no legal guardian listed. She was currently staying with a former teacher from her elementary school on a temporary arrangement. Jonathan's hand froze on the photo paper clipped to the file. Rebecca Sullivan. For a moment, time slipped. He hadn't heard that name in 20 years. But it wasn't just the name that caught him. It was the photograph beneath it, a woman with wild auburn hair and eyes that still haunted his dreams. Her smile hadn't changed. Not one bit. Rebecca had been his first love. They met when he was in his final year of med school at Stanford. She was studying art therapy, wild-spirited, and utterly unconcerned with wealth or reputation. She painted the world the way she wanted to see it, bright, unafraid, open. They'd spent 2 whirlwind years together, sneaking out to vineyards in the middle of the night, making promises under the stars, dreaming about a life that never quite fit the real world. But then came the offer from the East Coast, a fast-track surgical residency at Johns Hopkins. The kind of offer you didn't say no to. He remembered the night he told her he was leaving. The way she didn't cry right away, the way she only said, "You'll forget me." He remembered laughing, telling her that was impossible. But the truth is, he hadn't forgotten. He had just buried her beneath the decades of ambition. Now, staring at her face again, knowing she was gone, and that Mira, her daughter, had shown up at Elise's funeral, he couldn't breathe. "Do we know who the father is?" he asked, barely above a whisper. Gabe hesitated. "There's no name on the birth certificate, but—" Jonathan looked up. "There's a letter," Gabe said. "It was found in Rebecca's belongings." Unsent. Jonathan opened the second envelope in the folder. The handwriting stopped his heart. "Dear Jonathan," it began, "I don't know if this letter will ever reach you, but I wanted you to know the truth, the truth." His hand shook as he read. Rebecca had never told him she was pregnant. She wrote that by the time she knew for certain, he was already in Baltimore making headlines, saving lives. She didn't want to disrupt his future. She didn't want Mira to grow up as a burden or a shadow of what could have been. So she raised her alone. Proudly, fiercely. She looks like you when she's thinking Rebecca had written, and like me when she laughs. Jonathan couldn't finish the letter. He pressed it against his chest and wept. For the first time since Elise died, he allowed himself to break. He hadn't just lost a wife. He had lost the chance to be a father. He had missed first steps, first words, scraped knees, bedtime stories. While he was chasing accolades, a little girl was growing up without ever knowing the man who helped bring her into the world. There's a particular kind of guilt that comes from absence, not from neglect, not from malice, but from unknowing. It's quieter, but no less cruel. And that's what consumed Jonathan now. He stood by his window that evening looking out at the skyline of San Francisco. He had built empires, but he had lost a kingdom that truly mattered. He thought about Rebecca fighting cancer alone, Mira grieving a mother in silence, and himself surrounded by wealth and legacy, yet more isolated than ever. What haunted him most wasn't that he didn't know. It was the question, what if he had? Would he have stayed? Would he have been the man they needed? Or would he have still run? That night he made a choice. Not out of guilt, not out of regret, but out of something much deeper, redemption. He told Gabe to clear his schedule. He needed to go to Napa. Not just to meet the girl, but to face the woman he once loved, the version of her still alive in the daughter she left behind. He didn't know what he would say, or if she would even want him in her life. But he knew one thing: he couldn't stay away. Sometimes the past doesn't come back to haunt you. Sometimes it comes back to give you one more chance. Napa was quieter than he remembered. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and distant vineyards. Jonathan Callahan arrived just before sunset, the sky painted in gold and violet, and for a moment he stood beside his rental car and simply breathed. It had been 2 decades since he last walked this land, but somehow it still held pieces of his past, like the ghost of a song he hadn't heard in years. He followed Gabe's directions to a small community center just outside St. Helena, a modest building with peeling blue shutters and ivy crawling up the side. This was where Mira spent most of her time, according to Lucille, the former teacher now serving as Mira's temporary guardian. Lucille met him at the entrance. A woman in her late 50s. She had kind eyes and a posture that carried both strength and exhaustion. She led him down a quiet hallway past shelves of donated books and finger-painted posters until they reached a door labeled Art Studio. She doesn't talk much, Lucille said gently, but she listens, and she sees everything. Jonathan nodded, unsure how to prepare himself. He stepped into the room. Mira sat at the far end, her back turned, completely immersed in her painting. Her wheelchair was nestled beside a tall easel brushes, and tubes of paint scattered around her in a careful chaos. Sunlight streamed through the windows, catching her curls in soft, amber light. She didn't notice him at first. It gave him time to see what she was working on. The canvas was nearly complete, a portrait abstract yet unmistakable. A tall man in a black suit. His face wasn't finished, as if the painter couldn't decide how to capture it. But the posture, the weight in the shoulders, the loneliness in the stance, it was him. Jonathan swallowed hard. "You're the man from the funeral," she said suddenly without turning. Her voice was small but clear, calm. It startled him. "I am," he replied, stepping closer. "I didn't expect to see myself here." She dipped her brush in red paint and added a soft curve to the sky behind the figure. "You looked sad." He knelt beside her wheelchair, his knees aching more than he'd like to admit. "I was." Mira set her brush down. "Is she really gone? Your wife?" "Yes," he said quietly. "She was kind, gentle, everything I wasn't." Mira looked at him now, truly looked. Her eyes searched his face with a kind of old-soul scrutiny, the kind that made him feel transparent. "My mom was like that too," she whispered. She didn't yell when she was in pain. She just smiled quieter. Jonathan felt something shift in his chest, like a lock turning after years of rust. "I knew your mother," he said. "A long time ago." Mira didn't respond right away. She glanced back at the painting. She said, "I had your eyes." Jonathan exhaled. "She told you." "Not in words," Mira said, "but I figured it out. When she got sick, I started reading her old journals. She wrote about a boy with steady hands and a busy heart." A tear slipped down Jonathan's cheek before he could stop it. "I'm sorry," he said, "for not being there, for not knowing." Mira didn't cry, but her voice cracked when she asked, "Would you have stayed?" Jonathan paused, knowing this was the moment that mattered. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I want to say yes. I want to believe I would have done everything right. But back then, I was too focused on building a life I thought mattered." She nodded slowly, absorbing the truth without flinching. "She used to say the world is too loud for soft people," Mira murmured. "That's why she painted, so the quiet ones had a place to speak." Jonathan looked around the room. The walls were covered in Mira's work swirls of color and emotion portraits with blurred features and skies that bled into mountains. It wasn't childish, it was raw, honest. "She gave me this," Mira said, lifting her paintbrush. "When the cancer got worse, she said, 'Make something beautiful when it hurts. That way, the pain becomes part of the art.'" Jonathan couldn't hold back anymore. He reached for her hand. She didn't pull away. "I'm not here to take anything from you," he said. "Not her memory, not your life. I'd like to be part of it if you'll let me." She didn't answer right away. Instead, she turned her wheelchair and led him to a second easel in the corner. A covered canvas rested on it untouched. "She bought this for you," Mira said softly, "before she died. She said maybe you'd come back one day, and if you did, you'd need somewhere to start." Jonathan lifted the cloth. It was blank, completely untouched. For a moment, it broke him. There's something uniquely devastating about a blank canvas gifted in hope left behind by someone who knew they wouldn't live to see it used. It wasn't just a gesture, it was forgiveness wrapped in possibility. Jonathan placed a trembling hand on the edge of the canvas. "Will you help me?" he asked. Mira smiled for the first time. "Not wide, just enough. I think we can learn together." And there it was a beginning. Not a perfect one, not clean or simple, but real. In that quiet art studio in Napa, among brushes and paint and ghosts, Jonathan Callahan began to learn how to love again, not through grand gestures or perfect words, but through presence, through shared silence, through witnessing the grief of a child who had already lost too much and choosing finally not to look away. Love, he realized, wasn't something you waited to deserve. It was something you built stroke by imperfect stroke. And sometimes the gallery that held all your echoes was the only place you could finally hear your own heart. The gallery was warm that night, warm with laughter, soft jazz echoing off the newly painted walls, and the gentle hum of community. Mira's latest collection had just been unveiled at the St. Helena Arts Center. The crowd was modest but vibrant. Local artists, a few donors, a couple of reporters, but for Mira, none of that mattered. Jonathan stood near the back, wearing a simple blazer, watching her from a distance, like he always did. Not because he wanted space, but because he was still learning how not to hover. He had learned over time that Mira didn't like to be the center of attention, even if her work demanded it. That night, she was glowing. Her cheeks pink from excitement, her fingers stained with dried paint. She smiled easily, nodded politely, even cracked a quiet joke with a woman complimenting her brush technique. For a moment, Jonathan let himself believe things were settling, that maybe, just maybe, the worst was behind them. It happened quickly. Mira had just finished a conversation and turned to reach for her water when her body stilled. Her hand dropped the glass. Then came the trembling. Her face went pale, her knees buckled, and within seconds she collapsed. Jonathan didn't think. He didn't scream. He ran. By the time he reached her, she was on the ground, eyes wide, lips tinged blue. Her chest barely moved, and then stopped. Someone called 911. A voice screamed her name. But all Jonathan could hear was the silence between her heartbeats. He pressed his ear to her chest, felt nothing. "Come on," he whispered, "not like this." He started compressions. 1, 2, 3. He'd done this thousands of times in hospitals, on helicopters, in emergency rooms, with blinking lights and screaming monitors. But never like this. Not on a cold floor. Not with a room full of people watching. Not with his own child. Mira didn't move. The paramedics arrived in under 5 minutes, but it felt like an hour. Jonathan's hands were still on her chest when they took over, shouting things he already knew. No pulse. Preparing defib. They asked for her medical history. Lucille tried to explain. Something about an undiagnosed cardiac condition. Something about a heart murmur they'd never thought serious. Jonathan's mind swirled with terms, possibilities, outcomes. But the only thing that mattered was this. He wasn't listed as her guardian. He had no legal right to make decisions, no authority to sign consent. The paramedic turned to him. "Are you her father?" "Yes," he said without thinking. "Legal guardian?" "No. We need permission to proceed with extended treatment if she stabilizes." Jonathan's voice cracked. "Then find whoever you need to find." And just like that, they were gone. The ambulance siren vanished into the hills, and Jonathan, brilliant surgeon, billionaire problem solver, was left standing on a sidewalk, powerless. He didn't cry, not yet. He just sat on the curb, hands covered in the memory of her stillness. Hours passed. The hospital called just after midnight. "She's stable," the doctor said, "but weak. Her heart arrested due to an undiagnosed arrhythmia. We need to run genetic testing to determine if it's inherited." Jonathan felt the world tilt. He gave them his blood that night. Signed whatever waivers they allowed. Sat outside the ICU staring at the pale glow of the monitor through the glass wall. When Mira opened her eyes the next morning, she didn't speak at first. Then, through cracked lips, she asked, "Was it you? The one who cried at Mom's grave?" Jonathan leaned forward, his voice barely holding. Yes, it was me. She didn't say anything, just closed her eyes again. But she didn't let go of his hand. 3 days later, the DNA test confirmed what neither of them needed science to prove. Jonathan Callahan was Mira Sullivan's father. There's a weight to official paper, even when the truth already lives in your bones, even when the blood matches the love. Jonathan sat beside her hospital bed that evening. He watched her sleep, the IV drip pulsing beside her like a second heartbeat. And he made a promise not aloud, not even to her, but to the woman who had left behind this extraordinary child. He would not miss another moment, because life doesn't offer do-overs. It offers awakenings. And sometimes the night your daughter's heart stops is the night yours finally starts to beat. Jonathan Callahan never thought he'd fall in love with a vineyard, but as he walked through the hills of Napa Valley, wind brushing past his shoulders, golden light dancing between rows of Pinot Noir vines, he realized this land had been quietly waiting for him. Not just to visit, but to return to heal. It had once been Rebecca's dream to open a gallery nestled among these vineyards. She used to talk about it during their long drives through wine country. A place where children can paint the skies they imagine she would say, even if the real world gives them storms. After Mira's heart attack, something inside Jonathan changed irreversibly. His hospital board offered him a sabbatical. Instead, he resigned. 30 years of medicine accolades and industry leadership all traded for a small parcel of land and a big, unfinished promise. He bought the old barn on the edge of the valley, the one Rebecca had always adored. Time had worn it down, but the bones were strong. He rebuilt it, piece by piece, beam by beam, until it became something new, something beautiful. He called it the Sullivan Home. Not a gallery, not a hospital, but a place for children, like Mira children who needed somewhere safe to create, to recover, to speak through color when words weren't enough. The opening was quiet, just how Mira liked it. A few families, some former patients, neighbors, and friends. No media, no grand speeches, just warmth. Community. Mira stood at the entrance, a soft summer dress falling just over her knees, a delicate silver bracelet around her wrist, Rebecca's worn now like a quiet inheritance. She looked stronger, not just physically, but in her presence. Her voice, once uncertain, had begun to carry, and she had asked no, insisted on addressing the group. Jonathan wasn't sure she'd go through with it. Public speaking wasn't her thing. But then she wheeled herself forward, turned to the small crowd, and took a breath that seemed to steady the entire room. "My name is Mira Sullivan," she said, "and this place used to be just a story. Something my mom talked about on the hard days." She paused, glanced toward Jonathan. She used to say, "When you don't know where to put the pain, make it into something someone else can hold." I didn't know what that meant until she was gone. No one moved, no one whispered. I thought I lost everything when she died. And for a while I did. But then I met someone who was lost too, not the same way, but close. She looked back at Jonathan, her eyes softer than they'd ever been. He lost the love of his life, but he found the life she left behind, and gave it love again. Jonathan blinked back tears. He hadn't known she'd say that, hadn't known how badly he needed to hear it. That night, after the last guests left, and the lanterns began to flicker in the vineyard breeze, Jonathan and Mira stayed behind. She sat at the easel near the porch. He brought out his cello, the one he hadn't touched since Elise's funeral. He didn't ask her permission. He simply began to play. The melody was soft, unsure at first, an old composition Elise had loved. One that Rebecca had once hummed under her breath in the middle of cooking or cleaning or dreaming. Mira painted as he played, long sweeping strokes, deep purples, navy blues, streaks of gold. When she was finished, she held it up to him. A vineyard beneath a storm, and in the center 2 shadows, one tall, one small, standing together looking toward the light. "I think it's time," she whispered. He knew what she meant. The next morning, they stood before a judge in Napa County Courthouse. The process had already begun months earlier, but now it was official. He wasn't just Jonathan Callahan, physician, entrepreneur, widower. He was her father. It wasn't about paperwork. It was about something Mira had said one night in the hospital when the machines beeped and the lights were low. "You don't have to prove you love me. You just have to stay." He had. There's something miraculous about second chances, not because they're flashy or grand, but because they sneak up on you when you've already given up hope. And sometimes they look like a little girl touching your arm at a funeral. Sometimes they look like a blank canvas waiting to be filled. And sometimes they look like vows spoken without words in a vineyard that smells like memory. The Sullivan home went on to become more than just a program. It grew into a foundation, a haven, a legacy. And every summer on the anniversary of its opening, Mira reads aloud the last letter her mother ever wrote, found folded inside a sketchbook, never mailed, addressed simply for the future. "I hope you find him," Rebecca wrote. "Not because he's the missing piece, but because he's the one who'll remind you that your voice is worth hearing. Even when it shakes. Even when it's quiet. Even when it's painted in silence." Jonathan never got to say goodbye to Rebecca. But in loving her daughter, he found a way to say everything else. Because sometimes the life you were meant to build isn't the one you planned. It's the one someone else began and left behind for you to finish with love. Life rarely gives us second chances wrapped in neat packages. They come disguised as mistakes, as grief, as quiet interruptions in the middle of our most carefully orchestrated plans. For Jonathan Callahan, that second chance came, in the smallest, most unexpected form, a little girl in a wheelchair whispering 3 simple words beside his wife's grave. "Are you lonely?" It was more than a question. It was a mirror held up to a life built on control power and distance. A life that looked full on paper, but was hollow in the places that mattered most. Jonathan had spent decades building a world where nothing could surprise him. He rose to the top of his field, earned accolades, wealth, admiration. But no amount of success could shield him from the quiet ache of losing someone he loved, or the deeper ache of never knowing what he had lost. Mira Sullivan changed that. What began as a haunting encounter at a funeral unraveled a truth buried 20 years deep. A love once left behind. A daughter never known. And a woman who had carried it all with dignity, never asking for anything in return. Jonathan's journey was not one of instant redemption. It was messy, hesitant, painfully honest. It required him to revisit versions of himself he had long since buried, the young man who once believed in soulmates, the boy who once dreamed in color before the world demanded only black and white. And Mira, she wasn't just his daughter, she was his teacher. She taught him that love isn't loud, it's consistent. That healing doesn't come from fixing things, but from showing up. That even if you've been absent from someone's beginning, you can still choose to be there for their middle and their future. The night her heart stopped, something awakened in him that years of lost wealth and prestige never could. He realized that being present isn't about proximity. It's about vulnerability, about staying when it's uncomfortable, about listening when there are no easy answers. When he chose to stay in Napa to restore the old barn to create the Sullivan home, it wasn't just a tribute to Rebecca. It was a vow to do better, to be better, to turn regret into purpose. The real transformation wasn't in his job title, or the DNA test results, or the judge's signature on an adoption form. It was in the quiet moments, sharing paintbrushes, in silence, playing cello under vineyard stars, hearing Mira call him Dad, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. This story reminds us that family is not always born, it's built. Sometimes it's stitched together from broken places, from what's left after loss, from the courage to show up when you feel least qualified to love. It reminds us that forgiveness doesn't always come in words. Sometimes it's in a blank canvas left behind for you to fill. And perhaps most importantly, it teaches us that even the most hardened hearts can be softened not by force but by grace. So, what is the moral of this story? It's this: be slow to judge. You never know what someone's carrying behind their silence. Be patient with others and with yourself. Healing takes time. Be present. Not just when it's easy, but when it's inconvenient, awkward, or painful. Especially then. Forgiveness isn't forgetting. It's choosing to see the future with someone despite the hurt of the past. In a world that values speed, success, and certainty, stories like Jonathan and Mira's remind us of the beauty in slowing down, in looking again, in choosing connection over control. Apply this to your own life. Call that person you've been avoiding. Apologize. Forgive. Show up to the school concert. Volunteer at the center that always needs extra hands. Listen without fixing. Love without keeping score. Sometimes the most powerful legacy we leave isn't money or achievement, but presence. Because at the end of the day, people won't remember your resume. They'll remember how you made them feel. And sometimes what you give to one person can echo far beyond anything you imagined. Thank you so much for spending your time with us today. If this story touched your heart, if it made you reflect or even shed a tear, we'd be honored if you subscribed to our channel. Your support helps us continue sharing stories that matter, stories that heal, inspire, and connect us all. Until next time, take care of your heart and someone else's too.